I've been doing this Idaho Freedom Foundation thing but first of all, I need to thank Carla for having me here, and also to Carol, who hosted me at an Airbnb and introduced me to Carla. That's how I ended up. It's funny the relations you meet when you're just staying at somebody's house. But anyway, been doing this Freedom Foundation thing for the last 12 years, and it's been quite an interesting journey. We started out this organization to just provide a think tank to the state, to try to provide a different perspective to Idahoans, and maybe solve some little policy problems along the way. You know, maybe lower the tax rate a little bit, maybe get rid of a regulation here and there. But now, as Raul said, we're fighting to save our country. And it's interesting, never forget the really big, important role that a little state like Idaho can play. It really can be the beacon of freedom and opportunity, not only in the nation, but the world. But it's not been, if we're honest about it. It's not been. Idaho is one of the most Republican states in the country. I think the legislature is something like 85% Republican. And yet many of the policies you could not distinguish from another state, from more liberal states. We have a confiscatory tax rate that hurts Idahoans. We tax our groceries. Why do we do that? That's kind of ridiculous. Property taxes are out of control and getting worse. And that's a function of an establishment Republican majority that has ruled our state for decades. And how do they do that? How do they get away with that? Well, it's very simple. What they do is they go to Boise, spin into oblivion, pass a bunch of new laws, new regulations, and then they come back home and you ask them, what are you doing for me? How conservative are you? And they'll look you in the eye and they'll say to you, well, I'm pro-life, I'm pro-Second Amendment, I'm pro-business. And a lot of people don't ask many more questions than that. And you saw this happen, and by the way, when you start asking them questions, then they start doing misdirection. How many of you were at the Kootenai County Central Committee meeting the other day? And the superintendent of public instruction, a Republican, stood in front of you and pretended as if she's concerned about critical race theory. But if you go back and you look at the record, she actually opposed the legislature taking up the critical race theory issue. And being on the State Board of Education, which has oversight over our colleges and universities, she's done nothing to stop the social justice agenda on our higher education campuses. But when you start asking questions about that and your mind starts percolating these things up, what does she do? She says, well, I wrote a letter to Merrick Garland. You all hate Merrick Garland, don't you? Well, here, I wrote a letter to him. That's the misdirection that I've watched for years. I've lived in Idaho since 1995. And I've gotten to see this when I was a reporter. Don't hold that against me. That was before fake news. But I was a reporter, and I would watch this game that would get played. Whenever you start asking questions like, well, why are you doing this? Oh, Nancy Pelosi. Oh, yeah, Nancy Pelosi. We hate Nancy Pelosi, don't we? We do. But there's more to it than that. There's a lot more to it than that. Show me what you're doing to actually limit the size and scope of government. And many legislators simply aren't doing it. So a number of years ago, I was up in Coeur d'Alene, and one of our donors said to me, Wayne, how do I know if my legislator is conservative? Actually, she asked a very specific question. She said, how do I know if Senator Joyce Broadsword is conservative? Do you guys remember Joyce Broadsword? She was a state senator from Sandpoint. And my answer was, gosh, I don't know. I know anecdotally, I know on some bills that she is not very conservative, but I don't know how conservative she really is. So we created a way to measure whether a person is voting for limited government or bigger government. We called this thing the Idaho Freedom Index. And you'll find copies of it on the back table over there. There's also a lot of other stuff back there that I'll hope you'll take with me, because I literally broke my suitcase bringing all those pamphlets up here. But the point is we didn't know, but we found out. We found out that most members of the Idaho legislature were not conservative. That was really interesting. The other thing we found was that there was very little to distinguish liberal Democrats from Republicans. Very little. Now that's changed a lot. It has changed a lot because we're shining a spotlight on this whole thing. And in fact, if you read the Coeur d'Alene Press, I don't advise you to do it necessarily. Mark Twain said, those who don't read the paper are uninformed, and those who do read the paper are misinformed. So you decide which camp you follow. And if you do read the paper, then please read something else to at least get the truth. But exactly. Where was I going with that? I don't even know. The point is that James Rucci, who is a representative from eastern Idaho, who's a Democrat, served in the legislature in 2010, and then left the legislature and came back a couple years ago. And he wrote in the paper, "This place is different than it used to be. Very different. Something is not right. Because before, we Democrats used to get together with Republicans and pass all kinds of legislation and law. And now I've come back here, and these Republicans aren't doing that anymore. They're actually fighting against the stuff we used to pass together. What's happened?" Well, part of the reason is the Freedom Foundation. Now, I'm not going to take all the credit. I'll take a little bit of the credit. A lot of the credit goes to people like you. And I've had this conversation with the Kootenai County Republican Central Committee. By the way, Brent Regan's the chairman of the Freedom Foundation board also. So I'm not just saying this to stroke his ego. But the fact is that Republican Central Committees all over the state are starting to realize, they started thinking of themselves differently. They used to think of themselves as pep squads for the football team. And then one day they woke up and went, wait a minute, we're not the pep squad for the football team, we're the freaking team owners. And we have a star quarterback that hasn't scored a touchdown in forever. What the heck is going on here? And they've been demanding more. And so I was at the Elmore County Republican Central Committee meeting a couple months ago. And there's a freshman representative named Matthew Bundy from Mountain Home who scored 78% on the Freedom Index. I thought, well, not too bad, not too great, but not certainly not in the 50s. That's okay to see. But they were going to censor him because he scored so poorly on the Freedom Index. They were pissed. And they said, what are you going to do about this? And he says, you know what, I'm a freshman, I'll do better next time. There's some votes that I cast that I wish I hadn't cast. I promise you, I'm going to be paying closer attention to this stuff next time. The reason why we created the index was so that you constituents can see in real time whether your legislators are voting to increase the size. Because really it's like, Raul will tell you, when you're in the legislature, you get all these bills thrown at you. And one after another. And you might go, yeah, all right, fine, I'll create this new program. I'll pass a fee increase. All right, here's another one, it's a regulation. I'll vote for that too. And it's like watching grass grow. You mow the lawn to your house and you step outside the next day and of course the grass is still down all the way, by your feet. And then it seems like a week later you go outside and the grass is up to your knees. When did that happen? Well, it was incremental. And that's what's happened in Idaho. It's all very incremental. So we don't say to folks, look, you gotta vote for every bill that's on the Freedom Index, you got to vote one way or another way. All we're doing is saying, just recognize what happens when you vote a certain way over and over again. When you're voting for every single fee increase that comes your way, when you vote for every single regulation that comes your way, when you vote for every single program that comes your way, that's the cumulative impact of the Freedom Index. So maybe you'll vote for a fee increase here, but then maybe you shouldn't be voting for the next fee increase that comes along. Does that make sense? So the idea is not to box people in to simply voting for every bill that's pro-freedom or anti-freedom, but just to say, here is the sum cumulative effect of what you're doing. Here is why that is important. A lot of statistics get thrown out. What percentage of Americans die from COVID? 0.001%? What percent of American marriages end in divorce? 50%. What's the real pandemic? I said this on Twitter the other day and the liberals freaked out. That's the real pandemic, okay? That's the thing we should be talking about. Why are families hurting so much? And the reason they're hurting is because of government. Government is destroying families. Government is destroying marriages. Government is hurting young people. And not to pick on Sherry Barr again, because she's an easy target. But when she comes and she stands in front of you and says, you know what we need? We need more social emotional learning in our classrooms. That's not the answer. Get government out of the way. Who should be worried about the mental health of young people? Parents. So we started another project. Oh, by the way, so just to put a bow on the Freedom Index thing, the Idaho House of Representatives is the most conservative it has ever been in the state's history. The state Senate has some work to do. The president pro tem of the Senate is a guy named Chuck Winder, nice enough guy. He scored 42% on the Freedom Index. There's a North End liberal Democrat named Melissa Wintrow, 37% on the Freedom Index. That's to say that either one of two things is possible. Either both of them are very liberal, or Melissa Wintrow, the North End liberal Democrat, is very conservative. I can tell you the latter is not true. That's the problem. Imagine what we could do if we had a conservative House and a conservative Senate. Now I'm just going to throw this out for imagination purposes. Not that I'm proposing this policy tomorrow, but I want you to think about what can happen if we were to have a conservative House and a conservative Senate with the belief that big government is destroying our families. First thing I would do is I'd pass universal education choice. That's very simple. Our public schools are grotesque. And adding more money is not going to solve the problem. We've increased funding for public education by 50% over the last 10 years. More money is not the answer. There are schools in Idaho where 90% of the kids graduate and can't read, write, or do math. That's fact, that's a statistic. 50% is pretty normal. Ooh, 50%, half the kids. Again, not to beat up on a certain public school official from the state government. I really feel bad about this, I really do. But bragging about the fact that 50% of kids are passing a test, no one would brag about that. No one who owns a store would say, you know, 50% of my customers are happy. 50% of the food is cooked well. But we do that in the public school system. It's ridiculous. The government should not be in the education business. They're brainwashing the kids.